Hi, everyone. This is Jason Burek of Wall Street from Main Street. Welcome back to another Wall Street from Main Street podcast interview. Today's special guest is a returning guest. We've had him on in the past a number of times to talk about Bitcoin, anarcho-capitalism, and living outside the United States in a more free with more liberty. Thank you for joining us again. He's the editor of the Dollar Vigilante, Jeff Berwick.
Hey, Jason. Good to talk to you.
Now, Jeff, you talk a lot in your articles and your Anarchast also about the end of the modern financial system as we know it. You bring it up a lot, but why, in your opinion, hasn't it occurred yet?
Well, I've never said that it was imminent, but in many ways it's already occurring, as we can see all around us. Obviously, depending on what country you're from, it's already occurring. It's obviously happening in Argentina, Venezuela. Greece is on the brink right now. Japan's getting quite close now. So it's a process for sure, but really, it all started it essentially started in 1971 when the U.S. Went off the gold standard, and that essentially turned the whole world, except for the Swiss franc, into fiat currencies, and even the Swiss franc eventually became a fiat currency as well, with no gold backing it whatsoever. And it's essentially been a process since then of a lot of governments going into massive amounts of debt, a lot of the central banks printing massive amounts of money, and it didn't really get too out of control until 2007. That's when things really started to get close to the edge, and that's why we saw the 2008 almost near complete financial and monetary system collapse. And the solution to that, once again, was print more money. And so we've been seeing that going on now for the last 7 years. And I think we're getting very close to another break. I think we're going to have another massive crisis again, probably this year. I'm predicting September of this year, though it could be any time, and it could be sooner, it could be later. But it's very close. You see things like the U.S. During this 2007-2008 crisis, the total amount of U.S. federal government debt was around $10 trillion or less. And it's now close to $19 trillion. So it's almost doubled in the last 7 years. This is getting very out of control very quickly. We're now seeing the European Central Bank going into another phase of quantitative easing, which is just money printing and debasing of the currency. We've seen Japan. The Central Bank of Japan saying that they're going to double the amount of yen in the next couple of years, which is essentially almost hyperinflation by itself. So we're getting very close. We were very close in 2007, 2008. We're getting much closer now. Everything is much worse. Nothing's been solved. Even the Greece financial situation, which, of course, came to a head around 2009, all they did was they printed more money again and put Greece into more debt, and now it's coming back around, and the only real solution is to either let the Greece leave the euro and essentially end the euro very quickly after that, or print more money, which essentially will continue the euro towards hyperinflation. So we're getting very, very close. I never predicted that it was going to happen any day now. I've been talking about this for about 5 years. I've been doing the Dollar Vigilante. I said within the next 5 or 10 years, we're going to see a major monetary system collapse, and I still stick to that. I think we're going to see that in the next few years, not much more than 5 years for a complete, total monetary system collapse.
Yeah, I think that's very valid points you brought up. We can't solve a debt problem with more debt, regardless of what the Keynesians say. We can stimulate the consumer, or we could get people that doesn't solve the economic problems. How here in the United States, the real economy, there's not a lot of high-paying job growth. People aren't getting a lot of good full-time high-paying jobs. It's just, those jobs are just not really available, especially considering how many more people want a high-paying full-time job. I mean, the evidence is just overwhelming if you know how to look at the numbers and ignore the headlines that come out from Wall Street and the mainstream media about the real economy in the U.S. And yet, you brought up also how, these asset bubbles, they just keep printing money, and the bond market is rising. It's not in the mainstream media, they bring up how, the bond market's rising due to deflation fear, but I think the bond market is rising because it's an asset bubble. It's along, with the stock market in a bubble. It's along with the real estate market in a lot of key major markets in the United States or Europe or Canada. These markets are all in fiat currency bubbles that are in asset bubbles because, all these people that are in Washington, D.C. or on Wall Street or hedge fund managers, they all want to do carry trades with their, Japanese yen and stuff like that and borrow near zero and buy assets with, almost no interest rates.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of things going on. We're definitely in a government debt bubble. It's massive. And I think the reason for that is that, unlike in the past, these Keynesian ideas are, of course, always wrong-headed and ridiculous. Any sort of stimulus of the economy by printing money is always going to make things worse. You can't improve the economy by printing money. Just ask people in Zimbabwe. It's obvious, but because the central banks really run the world, they really want to just print money because it actually keeps them alive a little while longer. They're all going to go away quite soon, in my opinion. And so what we're seeing, unlike in the past where they used to try to stimulate the economy, for example, like in the Greenspan years, when they would try to reduce interest rates quite low to stimulate the economy, we'd see a lot of the commercial banks creating a lot of the money growth. Now we're not seeing much of that at all. What we're seeing is across the board quantitative easing and interest rates at 0%. We're now going on nearly 7 years of 0% interest rates in the U.S. essentially. And so a lot of the money printing is coming directly from the Federal Reserve or the central banks now. And so what they're doing is buying the government debt. And of course, the people who own the government debt are getting the first of that money. And most of those people who own it are people like J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs and a lot of the big banks. And so unlike in the past when it'd be consumers who would sort of be sort of generating the growth in the money supply. Now it's just mostly just money printing from the central banks. And of course, J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, they just go ahead and buy more debt with the money that they receive. And they also invest into things like the stock market. And so that's why we see all these bubbles. And we're not seeing this so-called trickle down, which is total BS to begin with, but we're not even seeing much of that. And you talked about job growth. I think the U.S. is now at its lowest participation rate of employment since the 70s. It's been downhill for a long time now. Of course, the official U.S. government number is at a low rate. It's around 5.5% right now, and all the mainstream media prostitutes are cheering. But really, it's just all they just totally just whitewash those numbers completely. They manipulate the numbers completely. They've been doing that for a long time. If you look at the way that they used to calculate unemployment in the U.S. in the 90s as calculated by shadow stats, it's around 23% right now, which I think is quite a bit closer than to reality than 5%. And even if it isn't, due to this money printing, even if there is a lot of employment, a lot of this employment is probably going towards unproductive or unnecessary activity due to money printing. So that's why money printing always destroys economies, because even if you make people feel like they're rich for a while, even though they're not, they'll go out and they'll spend their savings. And they'll spend them on unproductive things, and that's what happened in the real estate bubble in the U.S. A lot of people, there was cheap mortgages, and there's a lot of money around, so the economy must be doing well. So people invest in all sorts of condos in places like Florida and Las Vegas, and we saw what happened with that. So that's actually destroyed capital. So this whole system is a system of destroying capital. There's no way you can improve an economy by money printing or manipulating interest rates, and so it's a complete fallacy. It's a complete joke, really, what it is. And they talked about this always constant fear of deflation, which is ridiculous. I don't think there's a consumer out there who doesn't like deflation. I didn't hear a lot of complaints from people when gas prices went down recently, even though that's not technically deflation, but that is a lowering in the price of something. People in general like that, and it improves their lives in general, as we can see from technology. Computers are constantly going down in price, and no one seems to have a problem with that. Everyone thinks it's great. So it's a total fallacy. People have to stop listening to these central banksters and these politicians and governments who are just controlling and destroying the entire economy.
Yeah, that's funny you brought that up. I mean, it's also academia too, Jeff. I actually was at a party in the DC metro area, and I ran into a PhD economist who was from George Mason University. It's supposedly a libertarian program, right? From Russ Roberts, who does econ talk, and he considers himself a Hayekian. And here he was saying how bad Mises and Rothbard were, and he's saying he says he considers himself a libertarian, but yet he was defending Keynes against me. So he was and it was pretty clear, even though he has a PhD, he hadn't read the general theory and seen, he hadn't read Henry Hazlitt's line by line, going through there, A Failure of the New Economics, where he goes line by line debunking Keynes and all the ridiculous stuff Keynes said, how Keynes was quoting Marx in a lot of things, how a lot of Keynes's views were, just mercantilist rehash or the rehash of John Law. And we see evidence in the real economy of all this. that the velocity of money, if the economy was really doing well, there would be more savings, there would be consumers with discretionary income, there would be more investments from a lot of small businesses, and we're not seeing evidence of that, across the board in the real economy, because the more money they try to put into the economy with, these quantitative easing programs or other types of programs, the money either sits, at reserves at the Fed, so banks can use it as collateral to, speculate with it, or the money's leaving the United States to be invested elsewhere, or it's being given out as bailout money to foreign banks or things like that. So regardless of all the money that they've printed, it's just not really hitting the real economy in a beneficial way, which I think is what the Keynesians were hoping it would happen. But they have no touch with reality. They're just in an intellectual bubble, and their minds are closed to if this time fails, that we printed $85 billion a month, well, next time we need to print $120 billion a month or $200 billion a month. That's the only reason that they think is failed is they didn't do it big enough.
Yeah, that's always the case with them. It's never big enough. You just look at Paul Krugman, who is the sort of the speaking head for the Keynesian group, the New York Times economist, so-called economist. He knows nothing about economics whatsoever. He was calling for, after the tech bubble burst, which was all caused by money printing, he called for the U.S. government and the Federal Reserve to print lots of money and go into debt. And he actually called for a housing bubble, and he actually got it. And then when that collapsed, he said, well, now we have to print more money. These people have to be labeled insane. They're definitely communists and Marxists. They like central planning of the economy. And I can't believe that still to this day some people still listen to them. But they're going to learn the hard way very quickly where these sort of things lead. And it's going to lead to total and complete the end of the monetary system as we know it, which is actually a good thing. I think we have to end this. This is destroying the world. It's destroying economies. This entire system of central planning is actually central banks are actually a tenet of communism, and it's been in place now for over 100 years in the U.S. It's been ravaging and destroying the U.S. and impoverishing people ever since. I think it's good that it's going to end, but a lot of people have to be aware of how to protect themselves and be aware that it is going to end, or it's going to get very messy and they're going to get hurt.
Yeah, I completely agree. I'm hoping central banking will end. But, what they can do now is they brainwash so many people through so many years of government schooling. And then in university, if they get any economics classes, is, there's deflation enemies. When things go bad, and they always go bad, it's just a matter of time from, these Keynesian policies and stimulus programs and bailouts and things like that, or whatever, political spending program, whichever group of politicians are in power have, is they always try to blame it on capitalism and the free markets and say, we need more rules and regulations. We need to spend more money for this. We need to tax this industry higher. We need to redistribute the money to this, and then things will be fixed. But then, when they actually try to do that, then they make things even worse. And most people don't even call them on their bad track records. So I think it's just people need to wake up. They need to study financial history. And, they just need to get some common sense. And I think that's lacking. And I think that's why the Austrian School Economics is so important nowadays. Yeah,
absolutely. This has been going on for quite a while. They've actually taken over the school system as well, all these Marxists and communists, trying to create this very fascio-communist one world government. It's been going on forever. There was a cartoon in the Chicago Tribune in 1934 with essentially what's going on today, a bunch of politicians and central bankers shoveling money out of the back of a truck, and there was a guy who looks a lot like Karl Marx saying, spend, 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 under the guise of recovery, bust the government, blame the capitalists for the failure, junk the Constitution, and declare a dictatorship, which is essentially what we have today in essence. There's no difference between the two parties anymore. It essentially is a dictatorship of the elite, and that's what they're trying to do, is they're trying to destroy the economy and try to bring in their world, which they would control, of course. All the commies, they really like to share the wealth, but really what they want is to share your wealth with them and essentially get all the wealth.
Exactly. It's communism for us, for regular people like us, Jeff, but for them, the rules wouldn't apply. When you go back and look through whether it's Venezuela or the Soviet Union, the people who are espousing the Marxism and the communism and the socialism, right, or the fascism, the rules didn't apply to them, the people at the top. They had exceptions. In the Soviet Union, you could go to the gulag for the rest of your life. If you were caught, with American contraband, whether it was, blue jeans or American music or American movies or, an Austrian School of Economics book, if you're caught with one of these in the Soviet Union, I've seen a lecture from Yuri Maltsev, who's an Austrian School Economics professor, and he had defected from the Soviet Union. He said, owning a Hayek book or a Rothbard book or a Mises book in the Soviet Union meant, prison time. So it's just, and yet I'm sure people had these items or nice items like that they bought on the black market, but those rules didn't apply to them. And it's just really amazing that people don't understand. They talk about Marxism isn't being applied right and things like that. But Keynes and Marx, they didn't have a humongous amounts of difference. I mean, they both hated savings. They both saw that the problem with the economy was the savings glut. That's where Keynes got his paradox of thrift was from Marx, that there was a savings glut, and that's what was causing, workers' wages not to rise, and the workers couldn't afford the extra inflation costs and things like that. And, Marx had these views, and a lot of these views have, just been adopted by Keynes and all the other neo-Keynesians like Krugman. It's just really ridiculous. My next question for you, Jeff, to switch topics here a little bit, is about anarcho-capitalism. We touched on a little bit Mises and Rothbard. You seem to be one of the leaders of the anarcho-capitalism movement now. Would Murray Rothbard be surprised that the people in power have kept the game going and that they can continually get away with blaming capitalism and free markets?
Well, I can't read Murray Rothbard's mind, and he had such a great mind. I'd love to have him still here today to hear his thoughts. It seems to me that he was very rational and very he would look at things not in a sort of a light of things are going to end tomorrow. When he was talking about things, he seemed to have this view that it was going to be quite a while before we get rid of all these horrible ideas, these statist, centralized, communist, Marxist, fascist ideas, which we have all in the U.S. and all over the world today. So I don't know if he'd be surprised or not. I think there would definitely be he'd definitely laugh at a few things that are going on and be shocked that they're getting away with it still to this day for sure. Or maybe he wouldn't, because he saw a lot of that back in his time as well. So I don't know if he'd be surprised or not, but I'd sure like to have him around to see what his thoughts are on it, because he was such a wise person. He essentially started this anarcho-capitalist movement, which I was so surprised didn't already exist, because to me it's just a natural state of humanity is to be free and to not want to be ruled by others, or at least I thought that was the case. That's the case for me personally. It appears that a lot of people do want to be ruled for some reason, and that essentially means they're slaves. So I don't know, but I'd love to have him around. And as you mentioned, I am doing quite a bit in the anarcho-capitalist movement. I just held the world's largest anarcho-capitalist conference here last week in Acapulco called Acapulco, with hundreds of people flying in from around the world. So there is hope, and they're all Austrian economics and free market people. And someone made a comment about Acapulco. They came to Acapulco, and they'd also been to CPAC, and he said something like, Acapulco makes CPAC look like a bunch of card-toting Marxists or something, or warmongering card-toting Marxists.
Yeah, the thing is about Rothbard, I have read What Has Government Done to Our Money? I think it was written in the 50s or the 60s, and it was just very prescient. It's not a long book for our listeners who listen to this podcast. If they haven't read it yet, they should go read it. It's one of the shortest works of Rothbard. But, he talks about currency wars in there. He talks about asset bubbles, how the majority of the Keynesians in power are going to keep printing money, and how the majority of the money being printed is going to go to D.C., it's going to go to Wall Street, it's going to create enormous asset bubbles that, they're going to explain away. So he saw this coming, and I've read Mises too. And, he even saw all this coming, too. Years in advance, he saw the 1929 crash years before it happened. So he saw asset bubbles, too, that most of the extra capital being printed would go to the capital markets instead of actually the real economy. But that's how the Keynesians get away with what they're saying is, they have all these fake jobs numbers, fake CPI and inflation numbers. And, that's how they keep getting away with it is they keep changing the bar. They keep moving the goalposts to say, there is no inflation. The jobs problem is great. They count they count a part-time job as a full-time job now to make the jobs numbers look good. And, most people, especially these stupid trading computers on Wall Street, they don't even fact-check the figures. They just trade the headline numbers now, and most people just are too lazy or they don't care to look beneath the headlines.
Yeah, it's a sad state of affairs, what's going on in the world. Of course, in a real free market, people wouldn't necessarily need to understand economics because things would work fairly well. They wouldn't have to worry about these things. Sadly, today, if you really want to know what's going on, you have to understand economics, and we're talking about real economics by the people you were just brought up, especially Mises, because it's so confusing what they're doing, and they're putting out so many fake things that if you really want to know what's going on and prepare for what's going on, you have to pay attention. And it's a sad state of affairs. And then at the same time, they've also been essentially dumbing down the population through 12 years of public indoctrination camps, which now they're going to this Common Core math. It's just getting brutal. It's really like getting worse and worse what they're trying to do to people. And it's sad.
They're intentionally breeding the common sense out, right? I mean,
yeah. That's what they're doing. I think Stalin or Lenin, one of them, as Lenin said, that if you give me your child for 4 years, the seed I plant will never be uprooted. In the U.S. today, they have them for 12 years. They're trying to get them into kindergarten now, which public kindergarten classes at the age of 2. Then when they get out, they use propaganda to say, oh, no, you have to go for another 4 more years of programming. Go get your Keynesian Economics degree. It's going to cost you a few $100,000, and you're going to be in debt for the rest of your life. It's a complete system that is just reminds me of that Another Brick in the Wall by Pink Floyd with the song about school and the meat grinder. They're just putting a lot of people through a meat grinder, and most people don't see it. And so the only thing I think we can do is just protect ourselves, try to spread this information. Most people won't hear it because they haven't been taught how to, or haven't even been allowed to rationally use logic. There's no logic classes in school. They don't want you to learn. They just want you to memorize what you see on your TV and what you hear from the authorities and from the academics.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's very tough for people to think for themselves nowadays. I mean, a lot of people parrot whatever they hear off the mainstream media, like Brian Williams. They trust these journalists that are scumbags, that'll do or say anything for ratings or to get a bonus. Same goes for Wall Street. And, these journalists used to do independent investigative journalism where they would interview both sides and be more open-minded. But, now they come with a political slant with a huge bias on the mainstream media. My next question, though, Jeff, to switch to another topic, you sell a lot of second passports to people. You help people diversify out of the United States or Canada. How is FATCA? How are your clients dealing with FATCA? Is it really hurting them? And my second question is about second passports. Is it becoming a lot more expensive and difficult and time consuming for people who want to get a second passport to get them?
Yeah, first of all, FATCA, that's the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, which is the most egregious overreach of the U.S. government into world banking ever. They essentially are demanding that every bank on earth, not just in the U.S., but on earth, file with the U.S. government, every single U.S. citizen, any of their transactions. They're really shutting down the U.S. right now. So, yes, definitely FATCA is causing a lot of people a lot of problems. It's very hard for people to open, for Americans to open bank accounts outside of the U.S. now because of this, because most banks don't want to go through the process of having to file all this stuff. It's going to take a lot of work on their part and a lot of risk, because if they get anything wrong, the U.S. government has said they're going to tax them 30% on every transaction they make, just for if they do something wrong or if they didn't file something correctly. So a lot of banks are just opting out of that. And that's actually the what I believe is the true reason for FATCA. It's essentially capital controls, and they're putting it in a very nefarious way that most people don't see it. And again, most people are so dumbed down that they can't really see what's going on, and they're told on TV that the U.S. is the land of the brave and home of the free, and that it's the best place in the world, which it isn't at all anymore, unfortunately. And so they just don't even notice. Your average person doesn't even notice, but your average person who does want to get some of their assets outside of the U.S. is definitely noticing, and that's where we can help a lot. We have something called TDV Offshore, which you can just go to tdvoffshore.com. We can still find ways for Americans to get bank accounts. We have TDV Wealth Management, same thing, tdvwealthmanagement.com, where we help people to navigate around FATCA. There actually is ways. There's ways to get around it. It's getting harder and harder, though, so I would urge people, if they have a lot of assets in the U.S. and they're American and they want to get a significant part of them outside of the U.S., that they act now. I've been talking about this for years. They're closing the doors very rapidly. And you just brought up second passports. There's a lot of Americans who just want out, and we've seen record renunciations in the U.S. Every quarter. There's more, and they actually underreport those renunciations by a large amount. Excuse my chihuahua here. And it's getting very hard for getting foreign passports. We've seen the U.S. government going around the world and telling countries that they better make it very hard for Americans to get a passport in their country. I've seen this numerous times. I've seen it in Dominican Republic. And so I said this a couple of years ago as well. I said, if you want to get a second citizenship and get outside of the U.S., that you better act quickly, because it's going to get harder and the price is going to go up dramatically, and that's what we've seen. It's still possible, and we can still help at tdvpassports.com. I don't know how much longer, though. It's getting harder and harder.
Yeah, and it's not just the U.S. Who's doing FATCA. I think I listened to Gordon T. Long's work, and he just interviewed another expert, and he said, it's so many of these other developed world countries that are also planning to copy the U.S. For similar plans. So, they can layer on the taxes and track your assets. So if they have to do asset confiscations or a wealth tax, because I know wealth tax is being talked about by the IMF for European citizens. So it's just it's not right now. It's just the U.S., but I think it's going to be almost all the other countries because they're just so broke. They're printing money, creating more debt for a debt problem. But if the U.S. was so free, Jeff, then how come a brave hero like Edward Snowden, who's trying to reform the government, make it better, make it more honest and transparent, how come then he's considered a traitor? There's a Republican congressman who want him executed as soon as he comes back to the United States, or assassinated in Russia. He was just trying to do the right thing. He was had a guilty conscience. He reported all of these violations of the law to his superiors, and yet instead of everyone trying to do the right thing, you have these very highly paid government employees trying to cover it up and protect the status quo.
Yeah, there's so many things going on. We're seeing, like you said, wealth taxes. Of course, in the U.S., they have death taxes. Now, they have taxes on everything. You pretty much can't get out of the U.S. with any money anymore, even if you die. We're seeing bank bail-ins being put in all over the place. So what happened in Cyprus is going to happen all over. It's going to happen in Europe. It's going to happen in Canada. It's going to happen in Australia. They've all those three places have already put in legal bank bail-in clauses. So if the banks have problems, and they're going to have big problems, that they can just take it out of their customers' accounts, just like they did in Cyprus. So keeping a significant amount of your funds in bank accounts anywhere in the Western world today is highly risky behavior, in my opinion. And there's so many ways, of course, to get it outside of the financial system if you have a significant amount of assets, including precious metals. But again, I wouldn't just keep it all in the U.S. We've seen it's not out of the question that the U.S. government will confiscate gold. It's not like they didn't do it before in 1933. The U.S. is one of the least free countries on earth, of course, and they just constantly are doing these sort of things. And it's getting trickier and trickier. So we actually have a report called Getting Your Gold Out of Dodge. You can just go to goldoutofdodge.com, and it tells you a little bit of information about how you can get some of your precious metals outside of the country. But this is a highly dangerous point in time for capital, especially in the U.S. And if people haven't already acted to get a significant portion of their assets outside of the financial system, outside of the monetary system, outside of the banking system, and outside of the U.S. dollar, and also outside of the U.S., I would recommend that they run, not walk.
Yeah, I don't think the U.S. is the only country where this is happening. I think there's really no safe country. I mean, look at the stuff that's happened in Switzerland, how the rules have changed, and the Swiss banks basically bent over backwards to comply with the U.S. The Swiss used to be safe to store your money. So I just put out a video actually called the three most important rules of investing in the new normal. And rule number one is politicians can and will change the rules anytime they want. Perhaps, with so many different rules, perhaps, going forward on a daily basis. So we're starting to see rules changes. Normally these things happen, in developing countries and considered, third world countries where there's these radical rules changes going after anyone with assets and capital and trying to tax them. But, now it's come to the developed world because they've drastically overspent their budgets for Japan and the United States and Europe and the United Kingdom and things like that.
Yeah, we're seeing it all over the place. Definitely no place is totally safe, but I would suggest to internationally diversify somewhat at least, because at least if let's say you're an American, let's say you have a few $1 million in liquid assets. If you just keep that in a U.S. bank account, consider it gone in a couple of years, either through hyperinflation or through confiscation. If you keep it all in precious metals in the U.S., there's a good chance that as the U.S. government collapses, and it will, that they'll try to confiscate that gold. So if you have some of it outside of the U.S., you at least have some chance. And of course, there is some countries that are better than others. Funnily enough, who would have thought this 30 or 40 years ago? Some of the best countries to keep some of your assets are places like China, and of course, places like Hong Kong and Singapore and places like that. But we're really seeing a total reversal in where the safe places are. Now, I wouldn't keep a ton of my assets in China either, but my point is that you should definitely diversify and look at diversifying. I think a lot of the more sort of offshore private jurisdictions that are tax-free, these small Caribbean islands, things like that, perhaps places like Panama, St. Kitts, Cook Islands, Singapore for sure. Actually, I like that one a lot for diversification. Hong Kong as well. It's been a bastion of capitalism, although they're trying to crack down there. That's what those protests have been about. The Chinese government is essentially trying to take it over and probably make it a lot less capitalist. So, there's no safe place right now, and that's why it's important to get into quite a bit of hard assets and keep them in places that it's very hard for them to take.
Yeah, I agree. And even if the U.S. government doesn't completely confiscate physical metal, they already have a penalty, punitive type of tax code in place for metal because you can't lock in a long-term capital gains tax. There's no benefit to holding the metal long-term in the United States where, if you hold it for 2 years, you get an extremely low tax rate like on a stock, or it's not tax advantaged like real estate. So they've already penalized the tax code. But if, the paper metals prices were to spike, I could see them attempting maybe a windfall profits tax if they don't want to directly confiscate. So I think it's very dangerous, Jeff, and you bring up a great point there, that people should not have all their metal in just one country. I think if you have the capital to do so, you should store your metal in at least a handful of countries. Now, obviously, it's not going to be very cheap, but maybe there's more affordable services every year coming along where this is going to be more available. Yeah,
there's lots of places that I wouldn't put all my assets into one place for sure. Anytime you put your assets with a third party, there's a risk of it being lost. But there's places like goldmoney.com, which I like a lot, run by an anarcho-capitalist named James Turk. They have vaults in numerous different countries. You can just buy gold online and silver as well. And there's other sites like that have a fair amount of trust. So there is ways to do it. There's also things like Bitcoin that I wouldn't put a ton of my assets into there, but I think that is a good way to get around this end of the monetary system as we know it, as that is something that they really can't either find or confiscate or control. So it actually has some benefits over gold, but of course it's very volatile. But the most volatile thing right now, in my opinion, is going to be the U.S. dollar over the next few years. It's going to go from what is right now all-time highs against many other currencies to they're all going to go to zero. That's pretty volatile in my opinion.
Well, it's not just the dollar, Jeff, although you are the dollar vigilante. It's like every fiat currency. I mean, the volatility, normally currency markets just don't have that much volatility. They're maybe move 1 or 2% in a week or a month, sometimes maybe a day. And that's considered enormously volatile. But, we had the Swiss franc depeg from the euro, and it had like a 20% move, I think, in one day. The Russian ruble was attacked, I think, by the U.S. government and Wall Street, as part of the sanctions and economic warfare on Putin. The ruble, I think, dropped 20% in a matter of weeks. Enormous moves in the currency markets. Japanese yen, dropped enormously in just a matter of months. I think over 20% move. So we're starting to just see volatility in the currency markets, and I think long-term that's going to benefit precious metals and perhaps Bitcoin. I actually did have a question for you on Bitcoin. We've seen $300 million, I think, in investment money from either venture capitalists or larger corporations into Bitcoin and blockchain-related companies. Even though the Bitcoin price has dropped, are you still long-term bullish on Bitcoin and the blockchain?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. This technology is not going away. As you pointed out, there's been hundreds of millions of dollars invested into it, and it's not just by anybody. It's been people like the New York Stock Exchange has been investing into Bitcoin technologies. There's been all sorts of big names coming into Bitcoin. We just had at this AnarchoCapitalism conference, we had some of the top Bitcoin people, including Roger Ver, known as the Bitcoin Jesus, and there's nothing but positivity and things going on in the Bitcoin market. There's a ton of innovation going on. It's very similar to me to where the internet was in 1994. So I'm not at all put off by the fact that Bitcoin is now around $275. It was over $1,000 about a year ago. It was also under about $30 about 2 years ago. So it's definitely volatile. But I have a huge amount of optimism for what Bitcoin is going to affect. It essentially, for people who don't know, it's a complete decentralized free market currency currency that no one can control. There's no Bitcoin office. There's no Bitcoin CEO you can arrest. There's no, as I said, Bitcoin office where the government can send in SWAT teams and take it over. It's decentralized, and this is what changes the game. And so I think it's going to be incredibly interesting. I don't know where Bitcoin's going to go. It could, if it goes and becomes a complete currency around the world, which is totally possible, it would be worth probably somewhere in the hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars in today's dollars per one Bitcoin. If it doesn't, and if a lot of things go really bad, and who knows what could happen, it could go to zero. So that's your risk and reward on that one. But the technology itself and the as long as we still have electronics and the internet and power, which is actually going to be not for sure in the next few years. We're talking about potential for a complete nuclear war here coming up. Lord Jacob Rothschild, one of the Rothschild banksters, just came out and said he thinks that we're very close to massive war. I think we are as well. So those sort of things can really impact things. So along with having your precious metals and hard assets and some Bitcoin, also have some food in your house, have a gun. These are all part of my 5 Bs for surviving the end of the monetary system as we know it. Bullion, which is precious metals. Bullets, which is mostly for protection, although it's a good investment as well. Bud, I think the medical marijuana market, the cannabis market that is opening up, I think we're at the end of the war on drugs now, has massive potential for investment. Bitcoin, of course, and just being my other B is just just be aware of what's going on. Get right with yourself. Get right with your friends and family, because I think what's going to happen over the next few years is going to shock the world.
Yeah, you brought up World War III there. I mean, it seems rather obvious the U.S. with the puppet they put in Ukraine is trying to bait, Putin into, very larger conflict potentially with escalation there into potential World War III. But there's other types of geopolitical environments either in the Middle East or elsewhere where another large potential war could start and, other parties get dragged in. But the main place seems Ukraine for like the testing zone right now. With all the economic warfare the U.S. has done against Putin and Russia, and yet Putin's, approval rating still 85%. And, Putin's main political rival just shows up dead. He just shows up dead in Russia. It makes Putin look like he did it. And then, the Total CEO, the French guy, he's killed in Russia after he speaks out how the petrodollar needs to end. Only a couple weeks later, he's taken out. So it's just there's a lot of crazy stuff going on, behind the scenes that the mainstream media is not reporting. Yeah, we're seeing it all over with all these bankers dying. There's a lot going on, a lot more than anyone really knows, including ourselves. We don't really know what's going on. There's too much to follow, too much to look at, but there's a lot of stuff going on. You pointed out all the volatility and all these currencies. To me, that's just the ripples before the tidal wave, and there's so much going on you can't even keep up with it. There's wars and all sorts of things, economic, financial, political, all sorts of political things going on. We could see the complete breakup of the Eurozone and complete collapse of the euro in the next year or two. This is going to be incredibly volatile times, and just like before 2007, a lot of people got lulled into a sense of complacency. It looks like the market's doing good. Look, the stock market's up. Looks like money's going back into housing, all this kind of stuff. Don't get lulled into it. This is going to be 2008 times 1,000, which is, what is that, 280,000? But it's going to be really bad. It's going to be worse than, much worse than 2008, and it's probably going to start this year, and if not, I can't imagine it lasting much longer than next year. Yeah, it's a question of when and not if. I can't really give any timing because I don't know. Japan has a lot worse math problem in the near term than the U.S. The U.S.'s debt is larger, but Japan, their interest payments are higher than the U.S. So Japan their tax revenues are taking up. They have to put more of their tax revenues into the interest payments on their debt. That's my point. So the U.S. doesn't. Their interest payments are not as high as Japan's. So Japan will probably collapse first. If I had to guess, developed country to collapse first. And I think eventually, Jeff, all these currency pegs, like the Swiss or currency peg to the euro, I think all of these, whether it's Hong Kong or China, all of these currency pegs are all going to have to come off at some point because they're just choking on inflation. Anyone who's running a currency peg is just going to choke on inflation. And, they're just going to say, we can't do this anymore. We're going to have to stand on our own 2 feet. And, if we have inflation on our own, we have inflation on our own, but we can't import inflation anymore at the levels because, all the developed world is trying to print like crazy to, fight deflation. My last question for you before I let you go has to do with living in Mexico. You're good friends with Hugo Salinas Price. We talked about this on past interviews, and I've listened to you talk about this on other interviews. He wants to put Mexico back on the silver standard. What's your opinion on this? Do you think it's a high probability event that he can be somewhat successful at accomplishing this?
Well, first of all, he doesn't necessarily want to put it back on a silver standard. He actually has fairly low goals for what he wants to do. He just wants to bring a silver coin back into circulation, and he has a sort of a plan for how he wants it to be valued so that it would always be valued at a certain level. So as the Mexican peso continues to be devalued, people would still have something of value. And so even that, though, has not gotten much traction. And even from Hugo Salinas Price, who I think is the second richest Mexican, who runs Azteca Bank, he started up what's it called? The biggest electronics store in Latin America, and he can't even get just even one silver coin reintroduced into circulation and being actually taken as official money in Mexico. So, and he'll tell you that himself. It's not going very far, and he's not even trying to bring back a silver standard. You can forget about that. There's no central bank in the world who's very interested in going to a precious metal standard because that takes away all their ability to print money, and that's all they really can do. They only have two things they can do: print money and manipulate interest rates. So they can counterfeit and they can manipulate the markets. Two things that are supposedly illegal when everyone else does it, but when they do it, it's apparently there's no problem. So no, I don't see any hope for that. I see the peso just doing as bad as almost everything. The only thing I can say about Mexico is that the economy has been much, much better than in the U.S. Over the last few years. It's been growing a lot, and that's totally different than the U.S. The Mexican stock market, I think, is up 400% in the last 10 years. Some of that's inflation, but not all of it. And a lot of manufacturers have been moving from all around the world here. A lot of them have been moving from China because China's been growing so much that the price to manufacture things has grown a lot. It's gone up 3 or 4-fold in the last 5 or 6 years. So a lot of people are moving their manufacturing and auto plants and things like that to Mexico. So Mexico is doing pretty good, but the peso is going to end up just like every other currency at the bottom of the waste heap.
Yeah, I think we're in a global currency war. Only the Keynesian academics and the many of the developed world central bankers and the shills on Wall Street, only those guys say we're not in a currency war. We're clearly in a currency war where everyone's trying to devalue their currency. No one wants a strong currency. Everyone's trying to have a weak currency and get inflation going to boost exports and promote growth that way. But, everyone can't do that. So it's just going to put a lot of inflation into the global supply chain, and the inflation is going to end up somewhere, whether that's, in China with enormous wage growth, where I think wages, like you said, I think they've actually gone up. They started at an extremely low base, but I think wages are up over 500% in the last 12 years in China. So, that's affected their manufacturing base where, on a relative basis, factories have moved to Mexico or Vietnam. They've left China or now, Jeff, China's actually, I think at Foxconn, they're looking into robots. So the costs were so low in China that to manufacture from actual individual labor that most people thought they would never need robots. But now the wages have gone up so much that, robots are even being discussed now, replacing human beings in China and other cheaper places to manufacture.
Yeah, there's so many things going on. That's a whole other topic, of course, is robotization and technology is reaching the point where we're approaching the singularity. There's so many things going on that you can't even keep track of it all. And so that sort of goes to my point again, just to be very careful during this time. There's also a lot of potential for making money as well, but it's getting very hard. I definitely lean towards being safe than taking risks at this moment in time. I think there's too many black swans. I think there's so many black swans in the sky that it's pretty much an eclipse at this moment in time. And so I'm more trying to just keep what I have rather than try to make a lot of money right now. And I think it's Richard Russell of the Dow Theory Letters who said during this collapse, and he's been around a long time, I think he's in his 90s now, and he's been very omniscient on a lot of his calls, and he said the person who loses the least during this next collapse is going to win.
Yeah, I agree. It's very difficult to make good investments right now, especially in the resource industry, because the resource industry has been a cyclical bear market for a long time. A lot of the miners can't even raise any debt or equity at this point. Capital is very tight for them. So even if they have a good project, it's very difficult for them to raise money, or they're having to sell out for pennies on the dollar or just ride out the storm. So it's very difficult to make money in this environment. But I think that's why a lot of the money, flight capital, is going into the U.S. bond market. just out of safety. It's going into the U.S. real estate market out of safety. It's also going into the large cap dividend stocks in the U.S. market, which are, I think people are drastically overpaying for a dividend yield when there's really no revenue growth at all in these. But yet, people view these as safer than keeping money in their bank account where they know it's inflation or there's bail-in risk and things like that. So, it's causing unintended consequences, the actions of these politicians and central bankers.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's always the case. That's all they do, really, is just mess things up. Without government and without central banks, we'd have such a better world. It'd be so much more prosperous and so much more peaceful. But unfortunately, we still have both. And so if we can just get rid of the central banks, that would be a very good start. And, of course, there's been this big End the Fed movement, which is still growing, and it's still, even in a place like Germany, they have End the Fed rallies every week. So people are starting to wake up. There is hope, but it's going to be a transitionary period that's going to be very scary. So people have to be aware of what's going on. But you're not going to hear about it on CNN or CNBC or any mainstream media. So it's good that people pay attention to podcasts like yours.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we can't even talk. You can't even go on there, really. I don't even think they would bring on experts too much who even talk about being bullish gold. Maybe they talk about, because I've heard them or friends tell me that they say, we can't find anyone who's bullish gold. I mean, well, why don't they interview anyone like us? Well, we can't talk about ending central banks and how they manipulate all the interest rates. I don't think once, Jeff, in all the times I've watched CNBC and Bloomberg, and I really don't watch that much anymore, but I used to watch it a lot, and they don't even mention financial repression once, how interest rates are intentionally manipulated, and they're not even trying to hide it anymore. All these academics and all these central bankers are all talking about financial repression, how they have to do that just to keep the system from collapsing tomorrow. So, they intentionally don't talk about that. There's, fundamental justifications for this stock price going up and why people should be willing to pay 20 or 25 times earnings for this dividend stock when it has no revenue growth. So, they spend all day talking about stuff like that instead to get people, instead of missing. So they don't focus on the real important things. They just focus on, a tree instead of seeing the forest in the big picture.
Yeah, they're all owned by the banks, the J.P. Morgans, Goldman Sachs. They're all owned by the same people. They're all in the same club, as George Carlin put it. There's a big club and you ain't in it. And so people just need to turn off their TV, first of all. And secondly, get serious about protecting themselves. Pay attention to some of the things we just talked about. Try to get outside of the U.S. if you can. I think it's going to be ground zero for this economic collapse. And just be aware of what's going on. That's the most important part, because most people aren't aware at all. So when that happens, when this happens, there's going to be a lot of people in shock and a lot of people in fear. And when they're in that state, and when they turn off the EBT cards, or when the EBT cards don't buy you anything but a tin of cat food, it's going to be very dangerous to be around these people. So just be aware of what's going on and pay attention, but you're not going to hear it from the government or the media. As they always say, the revolution will not be televised, and this one won't be either.
Yeah, those are all great points, Jeff. In wrapping things up, please tell our listeners more about your Anarchast, and have you started planning the next Anarcho-Poco conference yet? And then also about the Dollar Vigilante.
Sure. First of all, Dollar Vigilante is just dollarvigilante.com. We have a daily blog on there. You can just sign up. It's free. We also have a paid newsletter for more specific information. I also do a podcast called Anarchast, which is the #1 anarcho-capitalist podcast in the world. We have about 1 million views now and growing rapidly. And you can just find us on YouTube. Just type in Anarchast. That's ANARCHAST. And to answer your question about the second Anarcho-Poco, we're not sure yet. We just finished with the first one. I just slept for 3 days after it. But by all looks of it, it was very popular and growing. So we'll probably do another one next year if we're all still here. That's really going to be the question. It's going to be a lot happening between now and then, so I don't want to make too many plans at this moment in time.
Yeah, I expect a lot more volatility and black swans here going forward. I think the last 2 years we had no volatility, and I think it was all due to market manipulations to try to keep the storm from crashing immediately everything. But I think the people in power, the economic and political elites, they're on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month thing where they're just trying to do anything they can, whether it's lying, cheating, market manipulating, printing more money through currency swaps and lying about it, backdoor bailouts and stuff like that, just to keep the game going, just a little bit longer. And they're not even thinking about anything in the long term. They're just thinking how they can buy themselves, another couple days or couple weeks or couple months.
Yeah, I think there is a long-term plan, but most of the people don't know it. There's a few people controlling the things behind the scenes. But yeah, the more lower down sort of people, they're just trying to keep this game going so they can steal more and try to steal as much as possible. And that's what we're seeing all over the place. It's like rats on a sinking ship. They're just trying to take as much as they can because they know it's going down.
Yeah, I agree. Well, thank you again for your time, Jeff. I really appreciate it and just enjoyed the discussion. And I encourage our listeners, if they're not familiar with anarcho-capitalism, to read Murray Rothbard or check out Jeff's podcast.